Catherine, Princess of Wales, walked into a state banquet and basically stopped time. And I don't mean that in a dramatic way. I mean, the room literally went quiet. It was July 8th, 2025, at Windsor Castle, and the occasion was the French state banquet held in St. George's Hall, which is already one of the most extravagant rooms in the world. Gold everywhere, candles, centuries of history on the walls. And then Catherine walked in wearing a red Givenchy gown and the Cambridge Lover's Knot tiara, and suddenly none of the diplomacy happening that evening mattered anymore. Now, if you don't know the Lover's Knot, let me give you some quick context, because this isn't just a pretty headpiece. This tiara was commissioned back in 1913 by Queen Mary, who had it made to resemble a piece from her grandmother's collection. It's got 19 arched diamonds with a pearl hanging from each one. Experts put its value somewhere above $135 million, which is already wild to think about sitting on someone's head at dinner. But the real weight of this tiara isn't financial, it's emotional. Because for most people alive today, this tiara belongs to one person, and that person is Diana. Diana wore it repeatedly throughout the 1980s and into the 1990s, and it became completely tied to her image, her energy, her story. When Diana died in 1997, the tiara went back into the vault, and for a long time there was a quiet understanding within the palace that it would stay there. So when Catherine started wearing it, that was already a statement. But walking into this specific banquet with it on this specific night in this specific gown, that wasn't an accident. Nobody in the royal family accidentally wears anything. Everything is planned, approved, reviewed, and planned again. So the question everyone started asking behind closed doors was, why this piece, why tonight, and who signed off on it? I'll tell you who wasn't thrilled about it. Queen Camilla. By all accounts, the moment Catherine came through those doors, the mood in the room shifted in a way that had nothing to do with the French diplomatic agenda. Camilla has spent years, and I mean years, working to move the monarchy forward, to build her own identity as queen consort, and to gently but consistently put distance between the crown's present and the chaos of the 90s. That's not me editorializing, that's just the institutional reality of what her role requires. Every time Catherine puts on that tiara, all of that work gets complicated. The public doesn't see a Princess of Wales honoring the royal collection. They see Diana immediately, automatically. It's almost like muscle memory at this point. And according to sources close to the palace administration, the fallout started within 3 minutes of Catherine's arrival. An encrypted communication was reportedly sent from the Queen's private secretary to the Lord Chamberlain at 8:35 that evening. No shouting, no scenes, just the very controlled, very deliberate panic of people who manage royal optics for a living, suddenly realizing the entire visual narrative of the evening had just been rewritten by a woman in pearls. A senior aide was overheard on the North Terrace that night questioning how the vault access had been authorized, saying that 6 months of branding work had essentially just been undone in a single entrance. And honestly, when you think about it, that's not an exaggeration. That's just what happened. Here's the thing about Catherine that I think gets overlooked in a lot of these conversations. She came back from a cancer diagnosis. She went through treatment in 2024, largely out of the public eye, and when she came back, something was different. There was a shift in how she was carrying herself, in the choices she was making, and the tiara was part of that. Wearing the Lover's Knot after everything she had been through wasn't just a fashion decision, it was a declaration. It was her saying, I'm still here, I know exactly who I am, and I know exactly what this means. The palace couldn't really argue with that publicly, without looking incredibly cold toward a woman who had just survived cancer. So what we have here is a situation where Catherine holds a kind of untouchable authority that is both personal and symbolic at the same time. And she knows it. The tiara functions almost like a legal document she gets to wear on her head. Because of the way the pieces tied to the title of Princess of Wales are categorized within the royal collection, Catherine has protections around her access to certain items that even the Queen Consort's office can't easily override. There are reportedly internal palace documents, possibly including something attached to Queen Elizabeth's will that reserves specific pieces for the direct bloodline, which means that even if Camilla's team wanted to block access to the Lover's Knot, the legal and institutional machinery just doesn't work in their favor. Now, I want to be clear that we're talking about a very specific kind of conflict here. This is not screaming matches in hallways. This is quiet, formal, bureaucratic friction, approvals that take longer than they should, scheduling that gets slightly complicated, invitations that arrive a little late. It's the kind of power struggle that only makes sense when you understand that in the monarchy, everything moves through paperwork and protocol, and the person who controls the paperwork has enormous leverage. And right now, there are factions within the palace actively trying to rewrite those rules in real time. What you have is essentially three camps operating inside the same institution. William and Catherine's side, focused entirely on protecting the direct lineage and building toward the future. Camilla's executive branch, trying to modernize and stabilize the monarchy by moving past the Diana era. And King Charles, sitting somewhere in the middle, personally loyal to his wife but institutionally dependent on his son, and increasingly unable to keep both of those realities in balance. That tension is what produced the moment on July 8th, and it's also what's been quietly building towards something much larger since then. And if you think that banquet was tense, just wait until you hear what happened by March of 2026, because the situation escalated in a way that made July look like a warm-up. But before we get there, let's talk about the mechanics of how this tiara actually gets out of the vault, because understanding that process tells you everything about where the real power sits in this institution. The royal collection isn't just a storage room, it's a bureaucratic system with multiple layers of authorization, and moving something as politically charged as the lever's knot requires sign-off at three distinct levels. The first is the Royal Collection Trust, which handles the archival side. Every loan request gets logged, tracked, and assessed, not just for its physical condition, but for its symbolic implications. Former archivists have described the lever's knot as a piece that triggers its own internal security protocol the moment it's requested, because the people managing the collection understand that releasing it into the public eye is never a neutral act. It's always a statement. The second level is the Royal Management Office, where senior courtiers essentially map out the visual hierarchy for any given event. Who's wearing what it means historically, how it interacts with the other choices being made that evening. This is where the internal politics get really visible, because the fact that Catherine keeps getting approved for this particular piece, rather than being redirected towards something less loaded from Queen Elizabeth's collection, tells you that someone with real authority is backing her choices. And most institutional analysts point to the existence of a specific legal document, possibly a will appendix, that effectively puts certain Wales-associated pieces outside the normal approval chain. If that document exists the way sources suggest it does, then Camilla's office was never going to win this fight through standard channels. The third and final gate is King Charles himself. He has to personally authorize the release of the most significant pieces, and every time he approves the lever's knot for Catherine, he's making a choice that his own courtiers have described as a painful institutional compromise. One senior official reportedly summarized Charles's position by saying that the king cannot afford a sustained conflict with his own future, so he authorizes the tiara to maintain the alliance with William, even knowing that the light it reflects creates problems for Camilla. That is a genuinely fascinating line when you sit with it, because it captures exactly the kind of impossible position Charles is in. He's the king, technically the most powerful person in the room, and he's making decisions primarily to avoid upsetting the person who will eventually replace him. So when Catherine walked into that July banquet, she had already successfully climbed all three levels of that authorization system. That wasn't luck. That was months of groundwork, institutional relationships, and the quiet enforcement of legal protections that the palace's executive branch simply couldn't override, and the courtiers who watched it happen in real time understood exactly what they were seeing. This wasn't just a woman choosing jewelry. This was a demonstration that the heir side of the palace had developed a level of administrative capability that could operate independently of the Queen Consort's office. The response from Camilla's team was predictable in hindsight. When you can't win a direct confrontation, you slow things down. Reports from within the palace suggest that in the weeks and months following the July banquet, the office of the Princess of Wales started experiencing friction in places that are hard to complain about publicly. Travel approvals taking longer than usual, patronage funding getting redirected in ways that required additional review, the scheduling machinery that coordinates royal engagements becoming slightly less cooperative, none of it dramatic enough to call out openly, but persistent enough to send a message. This was the institution trying to remind Catherine that symbolic power and administrative power are two different things, and that the people running the paperwork could make her life complicated even if they couldn't take the tiara away. What they didn't fully account for was William, and I think this is where the whole dynamic gets really interesting, because William's response to the pressure on Catherine was not what anyone expected. He didn't raise the issue publicly, he didn't make speeches or give interviews addressing it. Instead, he went quiet in a very specific and deliberate way. In meetings with the king's advisors and diplomatic functions, in the private social rituals that keep the palace running, William became noticeably cooler. Not rude, not disruptive, just absent in the ways that matter. The small talk that oils the machinery of royal relationships simply stopped flowing from his direction. And everyone in that world understood what it meant. He was signaling that any sustained campaign against Catherine's position was going to cost the institution something it couldn't afford to lose, which was his full cooperation. Because here's the reality that Camilla's team had to reckon with. A future king who feels that the palace bureaucracy spent years undermining his wife is not going to be a cooperative partner when he eventually takes the throne. The people running the executive branch right now are thinking about their own relevance in 5, 10, 15 years. And William essentially made it clear, without ever saying it directly, that their futures within the institution were tied to how they treated Catherine in the present. That's not a threat you can put in a memo. It's just a truth that hangs in the air of every room he walks into. By the time the Nigerian state banquet came around in March of 2026, the tension that had been building for nearly a year finally became visible enough that even casual observers started noticing something was off. Camilla arrived wearing Queen Elizabeth's Belgian sapphire tiara, which is a heavy formal piece with deep institutional associations. It's the kind of choice that says establishment, continuity, the weight of history. And Catherine arrived in a lover's knot. Standing a few feet apart, the two women created a visual that the palace's communications team had no way to spin into a unified message. You had the sapphire of the old guard on one side and the pearl of the people on the other, two completely different ideas about what the monarchy is and where it's going, expressed entirely through jewelry at a state dinner. The courtiers in that room reportedly understood immediately that they were looking at something that couldn't be walked back. This wasn't a one-off moment of symbolic friction anymore. This was a pattern, and it was becoming public enough that people outside the palace walls were starting to connect the dots. The question that everyone inside the palace was now sitting with wasn't really about the tiara anymore. It was about what comes next, because once a pattern becomes visible, the institution has to make a choice. You either address it, absorb it, or let it define you. And the British monarchy, which has survived revolutions and abdications and scandals that would have collapsed most governments, doesn't like being defined by anything it didn't choose. So let's talk about where this actually goes, because there are a few realistic paths forward, and they're all worth breaking down honestly. The first possibility is that some kind of quiet agreement gets reached, where Catherine scales back the frequency of the symbolic choices, wears the lover's knot less often, maybe rotates in some of Elizabeth's pieces to give Camilla's team breathing room. On paper, this sounds reasonable. In practice, almost nobody who watches this closely thinks it actually happens. Catherine's position within the public consciousness has fundamentally changed since her cancer diagnosis. She's not just a popular royal anymore. She's become something closer to a figure people feel emotionally protective of. Asking her to strategically dim that connection to Diana's memory would be asking her to voluntarily give up the most powerful asset she has, and the people around William would never allow that kind of retreat. The math simply doesn't work in favor of a peaceful step back. The second possibility is that the palace essentially splits into two operational centers that coexist without ever fully cooperating. This is already partially happening if you know where to look. William and Catherine's team has been quietly building its own communications infrastructure, its own relationship network with patronages and charities, its own media strategy that doesn't route through the central palace machinery in the way it used to. It's not a clean break. It's more like two departments in the same company that have stopped CCing each other on emails. Functional enough on the surface, deeply inefficient underneath, and increasingly obvious to anyone paying attention. The risk with this path is that the facade of unity, which the monarchy genuinely depends on for public support, starts developing cracks that cameras can catch. And once the public starts seeing the distance between the two camps as a storyline rather than just background noise, the institution loses control of the narrative entirely. The third path, and honestly the one that the current trajectory points toward most clearly, is that Catherine simply becomes the dominant public face of the monarchy going forward, and the institution quietly reorganizes itself around that reality. Not through any dramatic announcement or formal restructuring, but through the gradual accumulation of public attention, institutional access, and symbolic authority that she's been building for years. Camilla would still hold her title and her ceremonial role, but the emotional center of gravity for the crown would shift in a way that's already partially happened. The public has already made this choice in a lot of ways. When people think about the future of the monarchy, they're thinking about William and Catherine and their children. That's just where the attention naturally flows. And institutions, even ones as rigid as the British monarchy, eventually have to align themselves with where public trust actually lives. What makes Catherine's position uniquely strong right now is that she's managed to build something that no amount of administrative friction can easily dismantle. The connection between her and Diana's legacy isn't manufactured. It grew organically through years of genuine public service, through the way she raised her children visibly and warmly, through her willingness to be open about her health struggles in a way that felt real rather than managed. When she wears that tiara, it lands the way it does because people feel like they already know her. That kind of trust takes decades to build, and it's essentially impossible to bureaucratically undermine once it exists. And William understands this completely. His entire strategic posture within the palace right now is built around protecting that asset and making sure the institution doesn't damage it through internal politics. His silence in those senior meetings isn't passivity. It's a very deliberate form of pressure that says, we are not going to participate in a system that works against us, and if you push hard enough, we will make that visible in ways you cannot control. For an institution that depends entirely on the appearance of unity and continuity, that's about as serious a threat as anything could be. King Charles is the genuinely tragic figure in all of this, and I say that without any real drama intended. He's a man who spent most of his adult life waiting to be king, who finally got there under genuinely difficult circumstances, and who now finds himself managing a structural conflict between his wife and his son that has no clean resolution. Every tiara authorization he signs for Catherine is a small concession to the future at the expense of the present. Every time he stays quiet while the two camps maneuver around each other, he's choosing institutional stability over personal loyalty. That's not weakness exactly. It's just the brutal arithmetic of running an ancient institution while your own reign is fragile. What this whole situation ultimately reveals is something that the monarchy has always known, but rarely has to confront this directly. The crown doesn't belong to whoever's wearing it at a given moment. It belongs to the story the public is telling about it. And right now, the story the public is telling centers on Catherine. It centers on resilience and continuity, and the idea that something worth preserving is being carried forward by someone who genuinely understands its weight. The lover's knot is just the most visible expression of that story. 19 diamond arches and 19 dangling pearls, and every single time they appear in public, they remind the world that certain kinds of authority can't be reassigned by memo or managed by bureaucratic delay. The palace can rewrite the vault ledger procedures. They can complicate the approval timelines. They can maneuver in all the quiet ways that institutions maneuver when they feel threatened by someone within their own walls. But they cannot change the fact that when Catherine walks into a room wearing those pearls, people see something that connects them to a larger story about this family and this crown. And in the long run, that connection is worth more than any administrative protocol ever written. The institution knows it, William knows it, Camilla's team knows it, and Catherine, standing in that candlelit hall at Windsor in her red Givenchy gown, absolutely knew it too.